creates me.
Okie dokie.
I mean, gang does sound better than glang. Wow. M-I-G-N.
Didn't get food. There is green curry and chicken pad thai. So look at the food. Or the curry. Maybe Yasi or just in general. We'll have to start. Although he's got the mic, so.
Oh. Would you like to come talk into my chest?
Well, he made a joke about the types of making gas.
Oh.
So, classy. All right, so welcome to the September meeting this game. Glad y'all can make it. I'm glad. Games will be teaching us how to make money tonight. So, a big 5-field round of applause for Game.
Thanks. I thought y'all would enjoy some developer humor while we were waiting, but switch over to my real slide deck. So I have given this talk in the area. Anybody ever been to this talk when I presented it at one of the other groups before? Awesome. Okay, well, in that case, it's a brand new talk. I've never given it before. But the whole thing came out of just reflecting on, I was in consulting for years. I worked probably for more companies on more projects than the average developer. And that organically helped me grow my career in ways that I feel a lot of people don't just fall into, because you find an employer who treats you well and you're on a good team and you stick there for a while. So I realized that I had a lot of things that I wish I had known earlier, and there were a lot of other developers out there who are even in situations where it's even more difficult to progress your career unless you're intentional about it. So this talk was originally titled How to Be a Six-Figure Developer, and it worked. I mean, it got picked at a lot of conferences. It was very well received, but then I started giving it overseas, and the currency translation didn't quite have the same ring to it, like how to be a 30,000 rupee developer or whatever. So it became 7 Habits. But I want to start off by saying that I want to encourage everybody to be brave and to be vocal about discussing salaries. That's something I'm going to touch on here in this conversation. There's a culture of we shouldn't talk about what we make or ask people what positions pay, but recruiters constantly talk about that. They know all this information. Employers are very well informed. They know what all their employees make. So really, we're the only ones who are supposed to not discuss this topic. So we'll start off by talking about what skills are in demand and what kind of salaries we're looking at. And if anybody wants to throw in any information, any insight into the local market and what you're seeing, or just share what you're making, then please feel free to speak up. To start off by talking about skills, this is just a general market breakdown of the demand for different skills, and it'll scroll back up if you missed the early ones. But I wanted to give an idea of a lot of us think of ourselves as a collection of skills. And that's what you get hired for. And that can be true a lot of times, especially early in your career. They're looking for a Java developer and you happen to know Java, and that gets you in the door. And that's an important component of what your value is. But there's a lot more to that, specifically in how to assess what your value is beyond just that your skill happens to match one that's in demand. So how can you know what your special skills are, what makes you most appropriate for this position? The first thing would be to establish your value by looking back on what you've accomplished. And this is most easily done while you're accomplishing it. It's very difficult to go back 2 years later and say to a previous employer, hey, how'd that project do? How much money did the company make on that? So this is something that you want to start making habits around. That's why it's 7 habits. So how would you measure that? Well, the easiest one is obviously increase in sales, right? You work on a e-commerce site, sales go up. Maybe marketing was responsible for part of that, but maybe you can take credit. But most of us don't work in that situation. In fact, most development work is generally creating efficiencies. You're trying to replace manual labor with something that's automated. So how do you measure that? Well, the easiest way is if you had an employee doing this work and you now save that employee, say, a week every month, well, that's roughly a fourth of that employee's paycheck that you saved the company, right? Because you freed them up to do other activities. So you start correlating the results of what you've done with the financial impact on the company. And this will help not only in measuring your own value, but the reality of the situation is companies care about the value you're delivering. They don't care how many lines of code you wrote or how many applications you launched. Well, in the end, what matters to them is the value that was delivered from that. Now, you can't control all aspects of the value that's delivered, but you can at least be aware of that, and that's generally where people go as they mature in their careers, as they start gaining a broader perspective on the work they're doing. It's not just about this web page and how quickly it loads, it's about the impact on the business. So having that mentality is greatly valuable. Another one that's often overlooked is risk. You could create a disaster recovery system, redundancy for a solution, and it may never be used. You didn't make the company any more money. You probably cost them money rather than saving them money by setting up this redundancy or this recovery. But what if something did happen? What if the worst occurred and your solution was needed? How much would you save the company in losses? So that's another way to measure the value you've delivered. And of course, you want to tie this back to those collections of skills. You were brought in to be a Java developer. Well, that's great, and being a Java developer might get your next job, or .NET in this case. But what was the result of that? It's great for going in to talk to your current employer about a raise or moving into another position, because you can say, well, the work I did last year will save the company, let's say, $200,000 a year on an ongoing basis. So this helps to justify my $10,000 raise. It can also be used for going to a new employer and showing how valuable you can be. And then tying that back to the technologies that you implemented it with. More importantly, in my opinion, though, and I think the industry is starting to take on this perspective in a broader manner, is it's less about the tech you're using and more about your mentality, whether you're a creative mind, whether you're a problem solver, whether you're a learner, whether you can pick up new skills. Because almost every job I've ever taken, there was something I didn't know going in, some technology I needed to brush up on. So I'm not always, very rarely have I ever been hired because I had everything they needed. In fact, usually more than half of the conversation was around fit, cultural fit, team fit, which oftentimes the biggest aspect of that is the communication skills. And it's easy to take for granted, especially if you grew up in the same area that you're working. So you have very low barriers to communication. There's not maybe a difficult accent. You understand people's idiosyncrasies, the kind of phrases they use. You understand how to deal with people on an emotional level, like emotional intelligence. All these things are key to working on a team and collaborating with others. And this is another one that is usually big in the hiring process is what teams have you worked with and what sort of problems have you had and how did you address those? You want to have those sort of experiences in mind as you have those conversations. And especially if you're looking to grow within the current organization, how are you able to change over time? Maybe when I was brought on 2 years ago, I was a junior dev and I was working on these type of projects. Now I'm actually mentoring others. I'm taking on larger problems. Being able to reflect on this growth and how you've adapted to the situation and then convey that is key. And I don't want to gloss over the fact that all of this falls under the umbrella of problem solving. Unless somebody's handing you perfect requirements, because we all get perfect requirements, right? You're going to be doing some level of problem solving. And the more mature you are in your career, generally the more your focus is on that rather than implementation. Anybody familiar with critical observation? It's not a common phrase you hear a lot, but if somebody asks you to build them a report, you could build that report exactly how they asked you to and hand it off, and you've done your job. You've got an A+. But The question is, did you understand what they were trying to get out of that report? What was the purpose of it? What was it supposed to convey? And did you think critically about what you were creating in order to be able to give them feedback and help to solve that problem maybe in a better way and say, I understand that you were looking for this insight, but the report you're getting, maybe it isn't the best way to go about that. Or we often do this when we're working with users, right? They say, I want a button here. And you say, well, that's great that you think you want a button there, but what do you want that button to do? What's the purpose of this, right? Step back to the user requirements. So you've probably been doing this all along, but we're calling it critical observation. And then going back to how to work with the team, the conflict resolution. And that conflict may not be interpersonal. It may be a conflict of directions, of plans. We've got our team was planning on implementing this a certain way. We just got word from on high that the directives say that we have to do it a different way. How do we resolve that? Like, is there a conversation to be had rather than just defaulting to the prominent position? Any questions about the soft skills topics? These are just some of the things to keep in mind, and probably you're familiar with most of them, and these are things you've thought about before, but I think it helps to bring them back up and think about, reflect on them from your current position in recent history. So another habit to develop is setting goals. And you've probably heard the SMART goals acronym, and it might be a little bit overused, but I think it's at least good to consider the aspects of what makes a goal viable and valuable. So just saying that I want to do something, that's more of a dream, right? It's more of an ambition. And a goal actually needs to be something that you can work towards and measure your progress towards. And specifically, what actions are going to move you more towards your goal. So I don't necessarily say, well, here's where I'm planning on being in 4 or 5 years. But I think here's a direction that I'd like to move in. Here's a type of work I want to do, type of position I want, the kind of flexibility I'm looking for, and what sort of changes will move me more in that direction. One thing I love for this purpose is using a daily planner. And it's not because I couldn't keep all this information on my computer, right? I have a calendar. I've got a to-do list. It's not to replace any of that. It's really to keep me focused on what's important. And in fact, I really enjoy the daily planners that have these goals and tasks for the days and the weeks. So that way I can say, what am I working towards this week or this month? And what things am I going to do to move towards that? And if you do one thing a day towards your ultimate goal, you're going to move forward rather than look back on the previous month and say, well, I'm no closer to where I wanted to be. Anybody else have any other techniques they use? I mean, obviously there are a lot of apps and digital solutions. Yeah. A daily journaling app. So it prompts you for your journal so you don't have to remember to make that part of your routine. Yeah. And journaling is a great way we were talking about reflecting on your accomplishments. When it comes time for that review, or especially if they don't normally have a review process where you work, but you say, it's been 6 months or it's been a year, I'd like to sit down with you and go over what I've been doing, how I can improve, what my future might look like here. It shows a lot of ambition and motivation, but it also is a great way of highlighting your accomplishments because you can look back at that journal and you can say, well, I spent those 2 months working on that project and it was a success, and here's all the problems that I solved. And you break that down. Yeah. So the suggestion was the Pomodoro technique, the 30-minute blocks where you do 25 minutes of uninterrupted work, and then you set aside 5 minutes for whatever needs to be done before you get back to your next 30 minutes. It's also a great way if you happen to work in an environment where you have to account for your time, like fill out a timesheet, then you know that half hour was spent doing that rather than I spent maybe half a day, roughly. Absolutely. So if you're more intentional and more focused on what tasks you're on at any given point, then you're more focused on completing those tasks rather than, oh, and I need to get going on that. No, this is still sitting out there and starting a lot of things but not completing them. Yeah. Yeah. And as we know from the lean agile methodology, what what matters is completing, right? Not starting. You're not delivering value until you finish it. Right? Great. So all of this kind of gets rolled up into who are you? Like, how are you presenting your brand? Both organically, like when people see what you've been up to, but also intentionally. What kind of brand are you building? And this is the one you're inheriting, most likely, if you don't build your own brand. Because you're just a programmer, you're just a developer, you're a faceless name, right? But you don't have to be a superhero, and you don't have to build up some persona where it seems like you're superhuman in your abilities. This was my brand. I had been working for years, speaking, going to conferences. So I got invited to the Microsoft MVP program, and that was a great step. I'm trying to focus on my leadership, my speaking, my problem solving. But I also have a brand of I'm a volunteer firefighter in the county at home. So locally in the community, that's a brand that I promote for the sort of activities that I enjoy doing and how I connect with people. I also do cosplaying a lot. I like to go to conventions. I dressed up as a kilted Vader at Gen Con just in August, I guess it was. So it doesn't have to just be professional. You think about how the world perceives you and who you want to be, and make sure to express that. So one way to express that is through blogging. And you don't have to be the expert in something. You don't have to have something unique and new to express in order to put it out there. In fact, very often, the most valuable blogs are not things that are that niche. It's a common problem that people run into all the time, and there may be a solution to that problem on the internet. Maybe that's how you found the solution, but are other people going to find that same exact single page on the internet that you found, right? Or can you help to raise the visibility of that problem or that solution? Every problem you encounter is an opportunity to share that experience, even if you haven't solved it, and maybe especially if you haven't solved it, if you're looking to start a conversation around it. I'm struggling with this issue we've been having for a while. I haven't been able to find a great solution. Here's what I came up with so far. What do you think? And then people can start a conversation in the comments and discuss other approaches. And also, it's a great way of engaging people who you wouldn't normally connect with. I have some great friends in the speaker community that we disagree on just about everything. And some of them are extremely vocal about their perspectives. But our disagreement raises interesting thoughts and topics, and oftentimes we learn from each other. So, how do I put this? Don't be afraid to tick people off, is what I'm getting at. Don't be timid about sharing your perspectives. Now, you want to make sure you can back them up and that you can express why you said the thing you said or felt the way you did. But you'll find we're seeing this a lot in modern news and entertainment, is the people who are controversial, people who have topics come up about them, they're getting the attention and they're being made more visible. And it's also a great way of showcasing what you've accomplished. If there's a project that you're particularly proud of or a component you built that you thought was really cool, maybe you can't take that specific code that's owned by your employer and put it on the internet, but you could probably make a prototype with the core of what you're trying to share, put it out there, and then say, here's what I've got. It may not be the best thing, but what do you think? What's good about it? What's bad about it? What could be better? It goes back to that creating a discussion. And then this is better than a resume for most technical hires because they look out at your blog and they see the type of work you've been doing, the type of solutions you've been creating. That goes a lot farther than just seeing the projects you've been working on. Any other thoughts on blogging? Does anybody here have a blog already? All right, so a lot of people who can start blogs. Yeah, I mean, expressing yourself on the internet in general, blogging is more of like, that's a central place for your identity, but I guess your Twitter profile or your Stack Overflow. Yeah. Yeah, open source projects. Yeah, the idea is just to get your thoughts and what you're doing visible, right? Because you could go through years of employment without ever showing that to anybody, and if it was all internal work where there's not public sites that you built, what evidence is there to the general public or to your community? I will mention also LinkedIn has a built-in blog engine. So if you have the LinkedIn profile, which you should, then you already have the platform to start creating blog entries. You can always shift them to other platforms if you decide you want your own WordPress site or something. Close to my heart is speaking, and I know quite a few people here have gotten into that. And essentially, you're just telling a narrative. Like here, I'm kind of telling you the story of things I've figured out along the way, like mistakes I've made, improvements I've made throughout my career. When you're talking technology, maybe you're telling a narrative of how to accomplish something in tech, maybe something that went wrong and how you addressed it. So when you start thinking of it in a story manner, it's less about being an expert and coming up and tell everybody everything that they need to know on a topic. It's more about, is there something of value? And if it was valuable to you, chances are it's going to be valuable to somebody else. Great place to start is conference open spaces. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That could be the case, and it's probably good general advice, but it depends on what you want your brand to be. Maybe you're in Silicon Valley and you're surrounded by liberals, and part of networking and connecting with people is expressing those liberal views that you hold. It really depends on what your objectives are and how your brand fits with that. But yeah, generally, being mindful of how things are going to be perceived and who's going to potentially see it is a good practice. Y'all do lightning talks at the beginning of some of these sessions, right? How many people here have done the lightning talks? Awesome. Okay, so y'all are pros at this, the 5-10 minute intros. And when y'all do them, they're not all technical, right? They can be on any topic. Perfect. Well, you already know about that then. That's one of my favorite ways to get started because everybody's got something that they're passionate about. Well, or almost everybody. Most people do. And you can talk for 5-10 minutes on that, and just your energy and your excitement in it will keep people interested. Even if one of the best lightning talks I ever saw at CodeMash was on gardening. I don't garden. I'm not planning on gardening, but he was so passionate about what he had to say about it that it was fascinating. Anybody going to PonCon this Saturday? No? Well, when you go to conferences, one great way to both justify your ticket to your employer and also get some speaking experience is do lunch and learns with what you just seen at the conference. Well, they know you're not an expert. You just went to an hour session, right? They're not expecting you to come back and know everything there is to know about it, but there's still value that you can bring back to any coworkers, colleagues who didn't go. Or maybe they were at different sessions at the conference and they missed that one, so you can fill them in. And then, of course, if you're interested in going beyond that and getting up and sharing something to a user group, reach out and contact them. Because no matter how great of a speaker you are, generally you don't get approached about speaking opportunities. You have to be proactive. You have to ask and say, I'm interested in coming to talk to your group, or do you have a date that you don't have a speaker yet? They love that. I mean, it's the best thing in the world to have somebody in your back pocket that if somebody bails, if I don't have a speaker for a month, I know I can call them. And same thing goes for conferences. Most conferences will put out a call on a site like PaperCall, Sessionize. There's different Slack channels where they'll announce it. Twitter, of course. They'll announce that there's a call for speakers. So all you have to do is go to their website, submit your idea. Usually it's just a short title and a fairly short abstract, a couple hundred characters. It doesn't take a lot of pre-work to just submit an idea and see if it gets picked. Now, obviously, for a more technical talk, you probably want to do some preparation before that point, but I've had several talks that I haven't written until I got picked for a conference, and then I had several months to put that talk together, practice it, and get it down. sites like Sessionize or PaperCall will usually say whether they cover part of your accommodations. Yeah. Personally, I spend close to $10,000 a year on travel for conferences and user groups. I think I make more than $10,000 a year more because of that engagement. So that's how I justify it. But I also don't generally speak places where they're not at least meeting me partway, helping with airfare or giving me a night in the hotel or something. Yeah. Most of my employers have never covered my conferences. I'm fortunate if I get them to just give me the day off without having to take vacation. In my mind, that's of greater value generally than whatever the accommodations are that I'm going to need during the travel. But if you do, that's amazing, especially if they actually want you to go and they don't look at it as a negative to their company and team. But I also don't lead with that when I'm talking to companies. I don't start off by saying, I generally go to conferences at least once a month. In reality, they're usually over the weekend, like a Friday, Saturday thing. It doesn't have to affect my job in any great way. And there's a good chance that an employer might have a knee-jerk reaction about like, oh, wait, is this going to be a problem? Are they going to be gone too much? Or is this going to be a distraction? So just keep that in mind that while it should be a positive, that they're getting their name out there, being promoted, that people are going, oh, wow, this person who's up there talking on this is from that company. They must be worth looking into, or taking a call from their recruiter. Sometimes it's not the case, at least who you're talking to at the time. And then, of course, when you're doing all this, it's great to put things on the internet and to get up and share your insights and expertise, but it's a lot more meaningful when you make those personal connections. I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite things was to ask what people are passionate about, to figure out their passions. I mentioned that in context of lightning talks. In the US, we tend to go straight to what do you do for a living? That's not necessarily as common other places in the world. And I find if I ask, what are you passionate about? What are you excited about? It might be what you do for a living, and that's great if it is. But very oftentimes it's not. And like just last night, I was hanging out with a group in Ann Arbor, and I asked a guy what he did. He went straight to work. He said, well, I do ASP.network, mostly web development. I said, okay, great. Good to know. But I didn't necessarily mean professional. Just what are you interested in? He said, oh, I love board games. I was like, I love board games too. And we started talking about board games. That connection was a whole lot more meaningful than me knowing what technologies he worked in. Right? Pains are even more impactful oftentimes because what somebody's excited about is meaningful in the long run, but pains are more meaningful in that moment, right? Just today at work, I was struggling with this issue, and I can't get past it. It's unlikely I'm going to have the expertise to answer the problem that they've got. But the more you do this networking, the more you're connected with people who might have that expertise or who might at least be adjacent to that community or that technology. Again, just last night, somebody was talking about how they wanted to get more into data science. I said, well, there's a speaker coming here Saturday to speak at PonCon who is really into data science. Like he's got rigs set up at home, hardware that he runs virtual machines on and clustering, and I don't even know what all he does, but I want to get you connected with him, and then you can talk and see if there's some value there. And these connections are great in the moment, and you might remember them next time you see them, and they might come up, but the best way to make sure you get the most value out of those connections is to follow up. I try to collect, when I collect business cards or collect contact information, to as soon as possible, preferably that night when I get home, to shoot them an email and say, hey, enjoyed talking to you at this event about this technology. And it shows them that was a meaningful connection to me, but it's also a cheat sheet for me. Because if I ever wonder, like, that name sounds familiar, did I meet them? I can look in my email, and I go, oh yeah, we met at this place, and we talked about that thing. Like, it's a way of creating a log or journal, in a way, of the people I meet, the connections I make. And then you never know what sort of, like, follow-ups they may have. I've had people respond to that very general email saying, enjoyed meeting you and talking about this. And they'd say, oh yeah, by the way, after we talked, I met with so-and-so, and he said I should talk to you about this thing. And you never know where it'll lead. And giving that connection, especially since a lot of times if you hand people a business card, they may lose it. They may not keep track of it. Yeah? Is there, so we get home at midnight, and then you go and you write it. Is that a bad time to do it? You do it like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., but then you like 2 a.m. People spend time to do that. Really? So better to do it I've never had anybody express problems with getting emails at night. I feel like if an email is bothering you at night, that's your problem with your notifications. Okay. I suppose you could always draft an email and then just have it waiting and then send it when you think it's appropriate. Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that. Anybody here having feel like that's an issue, sending emails during off hours? Well, it's just so you don't forget, really. It's not so much about the 24 hours. It's more like every day that goes by, I'm less likely to remember to follow up on that. Yeah. I also wanted to mention that people like to eat, but more importantly, there's a primitive part of our brain that's wired to say, if I sit down and eat something and you're sitting there and eating it too, we must be part of the same tribe. Like we must belong to the same group because our primitive brain wants to protect that food, that vital resource, from people who might want to take it away from us. And even better, if you're actually providing me sustenance, you're giving me the thing I need to live, that's somehow subconsciously more impactful. So I like to eat and I like to drink. So if anybody wants to try this out later, we can give it a shot. But I would highly recommend if you want to talk to somebody, you want to like when I'm looking at job interviews and I go on LinkedIn and I see who works for that company and I say, oh, maybe this is a first degree connection or maybe I know somebody who knows them. I'll ping them and I'll say, can I take you to lunch and talk to you about what's going on at the company and get your insights on the job? And it might cost me what $15 to feed them at Chili's or Ruby Tuesdays or whatever. And that's a drop in the bucket compared to the impact that you make of connecting with somebody where you're feeding them a meal. We talked about asking for pain points, but more importantly, I think digging into what's going on in their world. So they say I'm really struggling with this thing at work. Taking an interest in how they're doing it. A lot of times people don't get that positive feedback at work of the satisfaction of somebody going through and recognizing how great what they did was, like how much they accomplished, how creative they were. So giving them an outlet to express that, and you don't have to drive that conversation, just opening the conversation so they can take advantage of it is, in my experience, quite useful. And then I already mentioned trying to connect people. That's probably the most common way that I seek opportunities to help people. My time is very limited. I'm not going to offer to do something for somebody generally because I've got so much on my plate already. But it takes me just a moment to connect people who could be beneficial to each other. Anybody else have any suggestions for connecting with people? Things they've tried and worked? Or things that have failed horribly? That'd be more funny. So here's just some questions that you can ask to get the conversation rolling. Again, I like to start with what are your passions? What are you passionate about? And then, of course, as we were talking about, you've really got to have a LinkedIn profile these days from a professional perspective. When I'm hiring candidates, first thing I do when I get those resumes is go look at their profile on LinkedIn, make sure they match. If they don't match, then there's some questions that need to be answered. But that's also where a lot of times you'll see recommendations. I was looking at some opportunities recently, and the person that I was talking to there had some recommendations from people who'd worked with them in the past saying how great of a mentor they were, how they were a champion for their coworkers. Those things really made an impact on me. Like that was great insight that you wouldn't see on a resume. And then also was mentioned Twitter profiles and open source. All these things are important. Any other, like I'm getting older, maybe I don't know what all the hip kids are up to. What other platforms should be included in this that people should check out? GitHub? I am familiar with GitHub. Not no like Tumblr pages or anything? Okay. And then don't forget that it's not all about being modest. If you're doing something, it's not bragging to say you're doing it, to put it out there. I'm speaking here tonight. I put it on Twitter that, hey, I'm going up to Detroit to speak at these user groups. If I didn't put it out there, and I've got a page on the internet where I have all my speaking engagements listed from the past. If you don't put it out there, then people won't know about it. I had a couple people say, hey, I'm going to be in Detroit. Maybe we'll meet up. That wouldn't have happened if I didn't put it out there. So that's really what all this is about. Is just if there's something that's of value, make sure it's visible. Of course, when we're talking about going for jobs, the best way to make it visible, at least initially, in that first step, is your resume. You don't want to try to cram everything on your resume. And this is going to be very subjective, what I'm going to say over the next couple minutes, so feel free to disagree. But I also don't think it should be overly personalized. I feel like a resume is just to get you through HR, through whoever's doing the screening, to the people who actually matter and who are doing the interviews. So when you're early in your career, maybe that looks like a collection of technologies. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, maybe you've been working, I like measuring by years of experience. I think that's a little bit more tangible than just saying beginner, intermediate, advanced, those sort of metrics. But whatever metric you use, giving them a general idea of where your focus is. Like maybe I don't know how intensely this person worked on JavaScript for 10 years, but I know they worked on it 5 times longer than they did in any framework. So I've got a general sense of where their focus has been. And then tying that in to the actual places you've worked, the projects you've worked on, so you can see, well, the 10 years of JavaScript, yeah, I see here's the employers and the projects they worked on where they used that JavaScript. Personally, as I matured in my career, I've tried to move away from being a collection of technologies. I don't want to be hired as much because I know a certain stack. I want to be hired because I'm good at the problem solving, the communication. I've spent years speaking to groups. I can get up in front of a C-level group and present an idea or an issue or a solution. So personally, I'm trying to move away from that bullet list. And the way I've chosen to do it, and this isn't updated, but it's just to give you an idea, is to have that summary paragraph, the one that I always avoided having because it seemed like, what is that there for? Now I see why it was there. It's there so you can give them a general sense of who you are. I like bolding the most important keywords because most people are not necessarily going to read it, but if they notice those bolded keywords, that might key them in to look a little closer at something that's relevant to them. And I've also replaced that collection of skills with a very brief line item timeline of what I've been up to. They can find more information into this down below. And for all you single page resume people out there, you might be saying, but wait, you've used half of your page on this fluff and you haven't gotten into the meat of what. I don't subscribe to the single page resume. I mean, when was the last time anybody here printed your resume? Anybody print their resume in the last like 6 months? Okay, a couple. I'm not saying it's bad to do it. I have recently been in a room where they didn't have my resume. I brought my tablet with me, so I had it right there. But in general, I'd say it's more valuable to have more meat on the bone than to try to limit yourself and maybe miss out on something that would connect with them. That said, real estate declines in value as you get lower on the page, right? That second and third page are much less valuable than that front page. So that's why I have the things I want them to focus on right at the top. So I want to make sure they see those bolded keywords. I want to make sure they see the highlights. And then they can look down below as a reference. This is like a glossary, right? I know there's a lot of other perspectives on resumes, and mine isn't the end-all and be-all. Anybody have any other thoughts on how it should be laid out? Or why this is a bad idea? So I'm perfectly, okay, we'll go with this then. Anybody here have a business card? Like, I don't mean your company business card. I mean you have a business card, like with your contact info. So when you leave your employer, it doesn't go to a phone line that's disconnected. When did you get your business cards? Awesome. So you've been doing this for a decade. Well, if you have any insight to offer, feel free to chime in. My main insight is don't try to cram everything in the world on this. It's the same as the resume, really, right? This is valuable real estate, and you want to focus on the things that matter. My first business card that I was intentional about designing, I haven't gotten to that yet. I'll get back to that. Think about what that brand that you're crafting, the image you want to portray, and think about the most important things you want to convey in that brand, and how is this card going to be useful for that? I think the most vital elements are obviously your name, They need to contact you, and there's the urgent contact, which is your phone number, and the less urgent but maybe more detailed contact, which is your email. And if you have any other information you want to convey, you can put it on your website, right? And your website could just be your LinkedIn profile. You can even buy a domain for $10 a year and just point that domain to your LinkedIn profile or your GitHub account or whatever, and all of a sudden you have a website, right? So I also like leaving a lot of space on the card for writing, usually on the back. Because when I hand that card to somebody at an event, I'm going to write on that card, met at PonCon, talked about data science. Because when I get home from an event and I have a stack of cards, I don't necessarily know unless somebody's written on it what the context was for that meeting. I'm terrible with names, so it's hard for me to put a name on a card with a face that I met. So I'm trying to do that work for them. And I do the same thing when they hand one to me. When they hand me a card, as long as I can write on it, I'll try to jot down some notes so that I'll remember. So it was completely black with white letters, like that one? So what you can't see in this image on the projector is this is the front of the first card I designed. And there's actually an @ symbol between my first and last name and a .net at the end, because that was my email address. Well, it still is my email address. And that was to make you go, oh, this is different. But on the back, it was almost completely blank. I had my phone number in the bottom and my website. So you had my name and my email in the front, phone number and website on the back. I got what you're saying. I just thought it was funny that I popped that picture up and you're like, yeah, they did this black card with white letters. So this isn't the card I use anymore. In fact, you'll notice that that white card that I put on your seats that has the sticker on one side, on the back of it is the same information, but it's for the tech conference that I run in Nashville. So this is the one I hand out now because most of the times I'm connecting with geeks like yourself, and I want to make sure they know about our conference and maybe submit to talk, that sort of thing. Any thoughts or questions on the business card thing? We're talking like maybe a few $100s to get some good quality cards. You don't have to throw them in every single fishbowl at every single restaurant. You can be selective about giving them out. They'll last you a long time. I like the generic approach where it's not very specific to what you're doing in that moment. So because I'm thrifty and I won't have to throw out a giant stack of business cards because something's changed. You can always write on them if you leave that blank. Just make sure that they're matte finish and not glossy. Otherwise, the pen might not write on them very well. Those stickers, by the way, are from Sticker Robot. It's the only site that I've been able to find that will do stickers where the back is where they can print on the back and it's matte finish so you can write on it. Sticker Mule does great stuff, but they will not do back printing, and their backs are glossy. Yeah.
So what I did was I took the office back and bought the one from out. So I went out like 2 feet and just pop them out. Just got our latest quality.
Mm-hmm.
That black. On the back of mine, when I was doing a lot of shooting, I actually had sort of like the bullet points of my resume. Like you said, don't use up the whole thing.
So one suggestion was printing your own. If you can do it in good enough quality to where you're happy with it, it gives you a lot more flexibility in what you put on it, what's important to you at that time. Maybe you have a laser cutter and you could do like laser cut business cards. Yeah, good suggestion. I also mentioned that I'm a big fan of the rounded corners. It doesn't take much for a square cut corner to get dog-eared and look a little bit ratty. The rounded corners help a lot with that so that by the time you give it to somebody, it's not torn up. Also a business card holder, something simple. I've got some stickers stuck in mine, but keeps them a little bit nicer for when you hand them out. So you've got your resume, you got your business cards, you've gotten through the HR hurdle to the people who actually know what you're doing and what you need to do in this job. Or maybe you're not looking for a new company. Maybe you've been working in the same company for 2 or 3 years and you're ready to move on. So you've asked to talk to somebody about what the next step is. The first thing is to make sure that you're more informed than the person you're talking to about whatever your focus is going to be in that interview, or as close as you can get. Uh, Anytime I talk to a company that I've never worked with before, the first thing I do is go to Google and do a news search. What has that company been up to lately? Has there been a merger? Have they released a new product? Was there an article written about what they've been up to? Are they having issues? Like, this is useful not only for preparing me for an interview, for a conversation, to where when they say, yeah, we've got this COBOL project that we're upgrading to .NET, and it does our procurement process, you can say, yeah, I read about that. I think HCA just licensed that, didn't they? And all of a sudden, wow, this person is really plugged in. They know what's going on. But also, as you gain more experience in the industry, you tend to realize, like, when companies are going through major changes, that affects the culture and what's going on there. So if a company just received a bunch of venture capital, that's going to have an effect on the daily life at that company. Maybe in a positive way, maybe in a negative, but it's something you want to be aware of. And then obviously learning about the company's products, the team you're working on. LinkedIn is my favorite resource for this because everybody out there is pretty much willing to take your call, to respond to a message. So you have all these free resources to get insider information. Past employees are the best because they don't have any real allegiance to the company, right? They're not currently employed there, but they can freely give you insight into what it was like when they were. The absolute best is when you can talk to the person who was in that job. Just recently, I talked to a company about a director of development role, and I was able to take the guy out to lunch who was in that role before, and he explained, here's why I left, but at the same time, things are changing in a positive way, and so here's the reasons why I think you might want to consider it. And so great insight just by being willing to say, hey, I'm interested in this company. Again, can I take you out to lunch? Can I grab a coffee with you? And all of this hopefully will lead you to better understand what they're looking for. Not just from a technical perspective, from the job recs that the recruiter gave you, but what sort of teammates are on the team? What sort of culture do they promote? What sort of soft skills or non-technical skills do they value the most? Is this an organization that values conformity and doing things their way? Or do they want free thinkers who will challenge the norm, who will speak up if they see something that isn't the way they think it should be? And don't be afraid to talk about your biggest successes. And it doesn't have to be in the form of what was your biggest success, or what is a moment you want to share with us. Almost anything can connect with the moments that you were proud of, the work that you did that was valuable. Once you start thinking of it in the context of what sort of topics are going to be important to this interviewer. So if you find out that several people who have previously worked for this employer said that they're all about teamwork and collaboration and being a team player, then start thinking about your past successes in the light of how that tied in with teamwork and how you collaborated with people. So when they ask those questions, it's a natural topic to bring up, to talk about. So we talked about researching the position or researching the company. And I mentioned at the beginning of the talk to be more courageous about discussing salaries. This is where that becomes really valuable. To be willing to have said, to ask people what kind of range, and I love ranges, because you ask somebody for a number, like how much does this position pay? That puts them on the spot. They feel like if I say a number, this is going to be what they want. Or maybe they'll think it's too low and then we won't be able to negotiate. So I always ask for a range, because then you could say 20,000 to 200,000. Like, that's a range, and you're not giving me any really insight. So once you get all this information, that gives you a better idea of what they're expecting, what they're looking for, specifically in the role you're looking to fill. And then you can set the target for where you want to be. Like, maybe I normally would want to be at 100,000, but I find out this position normally pays 130. Well, that would change where my target is going into the meeting, right? Because it's not all about what you need to live on, it's about the value you're delivering to the company. Along with that, the image you portray is going to vary greatly depending on the type of culture and the company that you're talking to. Some companies don't respect business professional clothing. They think it's fake, or they're just too hip for it maybe. So going in jeans and a polo or jeans and a t-shirt might be appropriate for that group. If you're, however, in a corporation where it's very business professional environment and you're going for a management position, Have you looked around and seen how the managers dress? Like maybe the people who are director level and above are always wearing dress shirts, and you're always wearing a polo. Dressing like the role that you're looking to fill will subconsciously send the signal that you're ready to fill it. Yeah. So you're saying search online for salary information from different sites? The interview, sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Oh, interview questions. Find those online. I couldn't hear everything from you in the back, but what I got was search for interview questions online. Right. Yeah, that's true. Most of the questions that people will ask in an interview are the same types of questions, just asked different ways. So that's a great way of preparing, absolutely. And what I thought you were saying at first, which is true, is like sites like Glassdoor are great places to go to look for where self-reported salaries for people who said, not just for this general position, but for this particular company, what do they pay? Yeah, it does range, and it's not necessarily updated. You have to take it all with a grain of salt, but it's still more information that you can take into consideration. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, you're right. You absolutely have to be consistent, and I hope I haven't given anybody the impression in any of this that you should be fake or that you should pretend you know things you don't. In fact, quite the contrary, I've literally been hired and told after I was hired that I was the only candidate who was willing to say in the interview, I don't know. And that was the main reason they selected me, because they wanted to make sure that I was willing to let people know when I was facing a problem that I couldn't solve as soon as possible rather than faking it and then them finding out when it's too late that I wasn't able to solve it on my own. So, excellent point. All this is not to say that you can't be humble in the process. I mean, you're sharing genuine accomplishments, genuine skills, genuine talents, but you can do it in a way that balances with humility. And that value I was talking about measuring at the beginning, this is one of the biggest takeaways that I've seen be impactful for people. I know I haven't talked about it as much as some other topics, but if you do your work measuring your value, the extra revenue you bring in, those risks you mitigated, the efficiencies you've created, including those on your resume may be helpful. But the resume just gets you to the point where now you're sitting in front of a person who knows what they're trying to accomplish, knows the business value they need to deliver, and this is the moment that that value that you measured can really shine. So you can tie it in with the things that are important to them that they're talking about and be able to say, on that last team that I led, we reduced the defect rate, the QA churn, by 95%. Like that's something that I measured for that team over the time that I was working with them, and that's immediately impactful to somebody who is having a lot of problem with QA churn, and maybe they're not doing very good requirements gathering, and they can say, okay, this person not only understands that problem, has the skills to address it, but they can demonstrate where they've actually delivered. And don't be afraid to ask them, like, you can not only ask the range, but ask them, like, what do you think I'm worth in this position? What do you think my value is? Especially, I like doing this when they ask me what I want for the role, because I'm happy to give them a range. I'm not trying to be cagey. I'm not trying to like keep them in the dark about what my value has been. but I don't know what my value is to you. You know better than me what kind of value I can deliver in the role that you're looking to put me in. So that's generally how I respond is I say, well, here's the range that I've generally been offered or that I normally get paid, but I think you would be in a better position than I would to say what I'd be worth in this role. And like I said, provide a range. Very often, in fact, in my experience in the consulting world, extremely often, the first person, their first choice, is not the person who ends up working at that company a year later. Whether it's because they were too slow in the hiring process and they already took another offer, or maybe they weren't as honest as you were and they got in the job and it was a bit of a bait and switch. Whatever the reason, whether they actually got hired or whether they didn't even make it in the door, very oftentimes the second choice becomes the first choice. So just because somebody says, we've decided to go with another candidate, doesn't mean you should abandon that conversation. I try to follow up fairly immediately with, thanks for letting me know. I'm still interested in the opportunity if a new one opens up or something along those lines. Sometimes I'll say, you mentioned this thing in the interview and I wasn't familiar with it, but I went back and looked and found this information. If it feels organic, that shows that maybe while I didn't know the answer then, I took the initiative to find an answer. That can help you bubble up to the top of their list. But just being proactive about it can often be the difference between that conversation continuing and them saying, well, actually the person that we were going to go with just took another offer, so would you mind coming back in or what have you. And I'm sure everybody here is already courageous and already outgoing and already willing to take a leap of faith into something new, but for those who aren't, change is scary, right? It's an unknown. But we live in a very fortunate time, in a very fortunate industry where opportunities abound. Entry level can be difficult, but once you get to that where you have several years of experience under your belt, it's really not hard to find work. Now, you could be picky. You could have a very specific type of job in mind, and it can be difficult to find that. But what I'm trying to get at is if you are willing to step out of your comfort zone and pursue change, hopefully the worst case scenario is that you have to take another job that you're not as crazy about. For most people, they aren't that fortunate. I mean, they could be out of work for a long time. It could greatly impact their family and their finances. So I feel like we're in a position where we have the luxury of being more courageous and not fearing that change quite as much. Something else I wanted to mention, we were talking about salaries and how to discuss salaries, how to have that conversation. One easy way, maybe you're a little bit more timid about being more outgoing and asking for numbers and negotiating, is to focus on the benefits that go along with the salary. This is a graph of what people said were the most important benefits to them, with flex time being the number one and training and certs being the second. But there's a whole list of things that you can discuss, maybe setting aside a training budget. There was one year that I did work for a consulting company where I had them set aside $10,000 to cover my conference travel. So that was an example where they wouldn't have covered that except for I made that part of my compensation. And it helped them to justify my paycheck not being $10,000 more. And then going back to the fearing change, I'm sure you've probably heard Michael Jordan talk about, you have to miss 1,000 shots to make one. I forget the exact quote. The more you fail, the more chances you have of success. And the people who are the most successful are the ones who fail quickly and often. You learn from those failures, and very often those failures will lead to new opportunities for success. So I try to, it's difficult in the moment, but I try to treat every failure as an opportunity to either move forward into something different or to grow, or it's not a negative, is what I'm trying to say, to fail, as long as you set up your environment to allow for it. And that's one of the things I actually look for in an employer, is this an environment where I won't be afraid to fail, where failure is not going to kill me, it'll just make me stronger. Yeah?
Success is going from failure to failure to failure with
That's excellent. Wonderful. So as I was saying, take risks and fail early. Uh, your biggest enemies in this scenario are going to be coming from inside your own brain. Um, you have to be willing to be realistic about the reasons why you failed. It's not about making yourself feel better or look better. It's about recognizing the reality of the situation so you can address that reality and not be blind to it. Um, hedonic editing is where you go back and you kind of modify that history in your brain to make it a little bit more palatable. It's best to avoid that. And certainly, if something's not working, be realistic about whether it's your approach or the direction you're heading in that's the reason why it's not working and the direction needs to be changed. I think I'm running out of time here, so I won't dwell too much on the risks and failing early because I'd like to have a moment for conversation. I will wrap up the slides with the thought that I believe Elon Musk recently said that you don't plan for success, you plan for habits, and habits lead to success, something along those lines. I forget the exact quote. But if you focus on these habits and you do those things, even if you don't know what direction you want to go in, I can guarantee you will see a higher level of success just by making these part of your regular routine and the sort of approach you take towards your professional and maybe even personal life. There's a couple guys in okay. There's a couple guys in Florida who run a blog called Six Figure Dev. They went to a workshop I did in Kentucky where I did the six-figure developer presentation, which was essentially this, just a slightly different format. But it was in a workshop. And they decided that they were going to take that and run with it. And I was like, oh, awesome. So they started with a blog, and they started doing blog articles. Then they started doing podcasts. Now they're sitting down with people that I would love 5 minutes to talk to, and they're just getting to have hour-long conversations with it. This is not to brag. I'm just saying this approach, these tips, and this mentality has been proven to work for people. So I would encourage you to at least keep it in mind. So since we do have time, why don't we take questions, and if there's something you want to jump back to talk about in more detail, we'll flip back to it. Anybody have anything that I glossed over? Yeah. You can blog about anything. I think going back to the comment about keeping things separate, like politics versus professional, you want to think about what audience you're targeting and what's going to be meaningful to them. So if you're trying to keep LinkedIn most focused on technology and what you do in that technical role, then that might be appropriate. I like bringing the personal into it where it's appropriate because, like, we work in kind of a monoculture a little bit. Like the geek culture, we share a lot of interests. Like, how many people here like board games? Well, that's actually a small. I mean, about like a quarter of the room, a fifth of the room. It's smaller than I normally see at conferences. There are these interests that are very common, so I find that putting some of that out there is a good way to connect with people and build relationships. But it's really more about what you're trying to accomplish and what you think will lead you there. Did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe one approach could be putting the content in a relevant forum, and then as you get feedback and as you see how people engage and how it fits into your goals, then you could always summarize and recap it in a blog article. You could say, I've been having this discussion, and here's what it's been about and the takeaways. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
LinkedIn like so much about where it's social media become really important.
Mm-hmm.
So people are looking for all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Scott Hanselman as well. He keynoted our conference this past summer, and he did his artificial pancreas keynote talk, which was a huge hit. Open source artificial pancreas, building one yourself, basically. And I agree with you that sharing those bits about your person or what your interests are is very beneficial. Can be. Good question.
I've got a question about the recruiters and some of these sites like Indeed and things like that. So the balance of it is sometimes you're looking for work, and you want to say this is the job I want. Help you get an interview. That sort of thing. What do you recommend for like somebody like keeping their eyes on the job market and things like that? What sites do you recommend?
Well, I haven't had a resume posted online on a site like Monster in a long time, mostly because it was more headache than I thought it was worth. I've never actually gotten a job through those sites. Of course, I haven't had a resume on those sites in a long time either. But I'm a big fan. Like LinkedIn has become such a center point of hiring in our industry that most employers, at least the ones who have HR departments, who have internal recruiters, they'll put job listings on LinkedIn as soon as they put it out there. So looking in LinkedIn jobs to see what positions are out there is probably my first suggestion. And then a relationship or two with a local recruiter, somebody who takes an interest in who you are, what your objectives are, where you want to go, and can be intentional about connecting you with the right opportunities has been extremely valuable to me too. In Nashville, Tech Systems has some really good people, and they have for a while. I know that varies by office and region, but I'd highly recommend checking them out. Yeah.
I look at it as, you don't put in doctors, you don't the doctors cars broken, you do mechanics, that's a good job. I look at your career and career is like that. We have connections to talk about your career in the local market. That's going to know you, they're going to know what your skill sets are, what your interests are, what your relationship with you. Sometimes you get by with an opportunity to get involved in that. That's really our approach. I don't talk to everybody all the time, but that's really our approach. Build that relationship that we have sometimes profile.
I think you hit the nail on the head with trust too. I would rather work with a recruiter who was not as well connected, but I knew that they weren't going to work against my interests, than somebody who was able to bring me tons of jobs, because I don't want to have to worry about that. Yeah. Good question. And for anybody who's watching the stream, that was nobody. Nice. And what was the name? What was the name for people who are watching the stream? HackerX. Yeah. I actually got an email from them once inviting me to participate, but I didn't pursue it. So it's good to know that people have seen results from them. Excellent. Well, if you're interested in consulting, like I mentioned Tech Systems, because if you look at my resume, I've actually done like 6 or 7 projects, I think, through them. But there was another company in town, Connexus, very similar consulting recruiting company. And what ended up happening is I'd do a 6-month project with Tech, and I'd do a 12-month project with Connexus, and a 3-month project with Tech, and so depending on how flexible you are as far as your employment, that can be a great option. Once you build those relationships and they know they can count on you, you can end up repeating with a lot of the same recruiters or companies. Was there any other questions or comments? anywhere that I went too fast or you want me to dig in more? Because like resumes, you could do a whole talk on just resumes, but I tried to just touch on a bunch of things. Yeah. Oh, you might not have been in the room when I kind of like, uh, I kind of poo-pooed on the idea of single-page resumes. I mean, there might be good reasons to do it, but I feel like the value of having more detail of not only where you worked and when you worked there, but what kind of projects, what kind of technologies, and what kind of value you delivered in those projects is more beneficial than the times when you actually print out a resume and somebody's holding it and it's like, well, how many pages is this? In a PDF, I'm more likely to hit Control F and do a search in your resume than I am to actually be paging down through it. And I just talked to somebody about an opportunity where that example with the COBOL teams and the .NET teams, that's actually from a real company. And my first job in '97 was COBOL development. So normally that wouldn't be on your resume, right? From 20 years, was it 20 years? Yeah, 20 years later. But it's actually relevant to something that I'm looking at. So 3 pages down, if they want to see that I actually have familiarity from 20 years ago with COBOL, it's there. Great comments and questions. Anybody else? Yeah. Hmm. It's an interesting question. I've read a lot of great books on a lot of topics, but I can't think of one that was specifically on problem solving. You got one? I haven't. So you mentioned the nomadic developer. Excellent. I didn't really get into the psychology of this. That's kind of a different talk that I give. But there's a book called The Power of Habit. So if you're really wanting to make these habits and you want to understand better how habits work and how to kind of hack your own brain, I'd highly recommend that one. It's very anecdotal. He tells some stories about people who had brain damage. Different parts of their brain got damaged. One person, they weren't able to form any new habits and how debilitating that was and the effect on their life. Another person, they weren't able to have any memories, so they only could rely on habits. And the things that, like if you asked them where the kitchen was, they wouldn't know. But if they got hungry and wanted to make a sandwich, they just get up and go make the sandwich. So it gives you more insight into what drives us on a daily basis. That 98% of your day is all habit driven, and you're not as intentional as you think about what you're actually doing. There's also one called Tribes by Seth Godin that digs a little bit more into that tribal mentality, like the idea of the connection of eating together. Yeah. What was the name again? Your best year ever? Got it. Okay. Excellent. Any other questions? Topics you want to dig into? You ready to go out for some drinks or something? Nice. Did I what?
Did you close some meat?
I was just asking for questions. Yeah.
Oh, you know, these are the priority.
Well, I did ask if everybody was done with the questions and ready to drink.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, I think all the questions have been covered. Thanks for having me.
Sure.